welcome to everybody. My name is Michael Walton. I'm a senior lecturer in the Kennedy School, teaching mainly in the MPID program. This is, I think, the third in a series of panels on diversity in development. It's co-sponsored by the Growth Lab, CID, and the group of MPID alumni. They call themselves the Elevate Group and have been really tremendously active around engaging with both issues in the experience of any discrimination and what it means for development. There's been, this is the third, there was one, a couple last, I think both last semester, one by Danny Roderick and Zoe Marks on the very genuine issue of the lack of diversity within development economics, which actually I should say is not true of the MPID, which has much more diversity than the overall profession. And then there was a session by Lant Pritchett, Christy Thornton, Mira Tiwari, and Megan Hill on visions of development. Today, I think this may be the first time where we've asked 4 alumni to talk, so it's particularly valuable. It's on the theme of experiencing and undoing discrimination. And actually something that I like about the approach that the Elevate Group as a whole has taken is actually both engage with personal experiences and in thinking of what that means and how to affect change. So we've got Amna Awan, Juan Rivera, Carolyn Fallert, and Rodrigo Salvador. I'm not going to introduce them any more than that because they'll be introducing themselves. And we're going to have 2 rounds of exchange and then open for comments. The first round, I've asked them to actually talk to some of their own personal experiences in their career and how that has shaped their thinking around difference, discrimination, power structures, and how that links to their experience of development. Then in the next round, we'll turn to what they think from their perspectives can be done in the development field. I should say we have a Q&A system, and those who are online, please write up in the Q&A. I think we have some in the person and we'll get some guidance there. I should say, since the spirit is to talk about person, I should say, as many of you know, I am a white man from the United Kingdom, a country that has a long colonial history and continues to struggle with many patterns of difference, not only on racial as well as class grounds. I grew up being kind of unaware of my privilege. I come from a middle-class background, and only now in reflection have I come to see how privileged I have been to have that. I first went to live in Africa in Lesotho, which was a detribalization for me when it was surrounded by the racist regime of apartheid Africa. And I've lived everywhere else. I've lived Peru, Mexico, India, and the United States has also, of course, everyone has struggled with different dimensions of power-inflected difference in the development process. So what I'm going to, each panelist has a few minutes to introduce their experience and themselves. And I'm going to ask Amna, please start. Welcome.
Thank you, Professor Walton. Hello, everyone, and good evening from Pakistan. I graduated from the Kennedy School in 2013. During that time, I had the opportunity to go and spend my summers in Liberia with the Finance Ministry. After graduation, I came back to Pakistan, had an opportunity to spend some time working in countries in the Pacific and Asia, but most of my work experience has been in Pakistan. I've worked on private sector development, financial inclusion, and women's economic empowerment. And it has been with various donors, including Australian Aid, USAID, UNDP, and my current project is funded by the Gates Foundation. So in terms of my experience with diversity, I think the first trip to Liberia was incredibly eye-opening, had incredibly strong influence on my opinions, my perceptions of the development sector, because over there were a lot of experts from different multilateral organizations, different levels of experience and expertise, etc. But then I also saw that the problems were so complex, they were so difficult to solve that no one expert had the right answer. So that was an incredibly humbling experience. And for many years, I had thought that I could fix the problems in the world because I thought I am intelligent and I have a good heart. But that experience really helped me to appreciate the complexity of the problems that we are dealing with. After coming back to my own country, I was able to visit all corners of my country, go to all sorts of villages, small towns, interviewed a lot of men and women, even in very conservative areas. And I never had to face any challenge because I was sent to that place by a donor in a big vehicle with maybe some proper secure arrangements as well. And for this reason, it was never a challenge to talk to men. I was surprised that even in very conservative areas, men will make eye contact with me and they will explain to me whatever problems they're facing in their business or agriculture, or how do they divide incomes within the household, when do they consult their mother, when do they consult their wife, and they would even allow me to talk to their wives, even though some people thought that that might be a challenge. So that's the power of privilege. Just because you're coming from a perceived higher income background, you can do whatever you want and still feel safe. But then that privilege is not always applicable in all situations. In my own office, I saw that male team members struggled to understand the viewpoint of female colleagues. So another one of my young female colleagues was visiting these same conservative areas. And over there, a local refused to talk to her and said that, you know, I will not participate in this discussion unless and until the woman leaves the room or the gathering. And my male colleague, instead of defending his team member, said that, yes, you should go and sit in the car and wait for us outside. So those are the perceptions that need to be changed. And in my future visits, whenever I used to go to those areas, I used to make a point to take a lot of photographs of mine, talking to shopkeepers, talking to retailers, distributors, villagers, being a part of those village gatherings. We call them hujras, which are the local drawing rooms of sort where meetings take place. And I had to come back and share those photos and tell to my male colleagues that you have to support your team members in these situations. So that's trying to bring about a change at a small level. But then bringing a change at all levels is not always easy. So this was a work in the western part of the country, which is extremely conservative. But then in the south, we have the province of Sindh, which is almost the poorest province of the country. Some parts are extremely poor. They face food shortages. And over there, we were working on agriculture. And after a couple of years of our work, when we did M&E, we saw that while productivity had gone up, agricultural yields had gone up, but incomes were still not going up. And the reason for that was the entrenched power structures. In this area, the landlords were very strong and they controlled all land. And the farmers were just tenant farmers who were working on those lands for the landlords. So whatever income did go up was actually handed back to the landlords. And for this reason, the peasant farmers would not experience any improvement in their conditions. And in that particular region, there wasn't even much difference between the men and the women, because both of them were so poor. They had zero decision-making power. They could not send their kids to school. They could not decide what to do with the additional income. All decisions in the household were actually made by the landlord. So over there, we also kind of realized the limitations of our work, that in spite of teaching them how to improve the agricultural productivity, we couldn't change those historical relationships that are similar to bonded labor, and they involve a lot of historical debt. And for this reason, it's difficult for tenant farmers to break away from the power of the landlords. So our program around private sector development was unable to bring about a change in that area. So those are some of the limitations I've also seen in my work. So that was a description of the problem. I'll hand it back to Professor Walton now.
Good. Thank you. I loved your comment that intelligence and a good heart is not enough. And your account of how you were navigating in small personal ways, actually, that even as a Pakistani woman, you came in with a lot of power, and that gave you opportunities to actually demonstrate how to engage differently. Thank you, Amna. We'll come back to this in the second round. Johannan, let me invite you now.
Yes, thank you. Hi, my name is Juan Rivera. I'm Mexican MPID 2013 as well. Actually, Amna and I were in the same study group. So it's really nice to meet again in this circumstance. I live in Washington, D.C., and I think that I had what you could describe as a cookie cutter MPAD route, or I was on the process of having so. I came to the MPAD and then I moved to Washington, D.C., and I worked in the World Bank for a little bit as a consultant. Then I went to the IDB. And eventually I landed up at Imago, which is where I work today, which is an organization. I mean, like, I think you have heard from different voices what we do, but like, it's an organization that works with grassroots organizations in helping them scale up, mostly in South Asia and in Latin America. Basically what drove me to Imago is just, I grew up on the hallways of an NGO, that was funded by my parents, and immediately and I think I needed that connection with the end beneficiary. And I, like, firsthand, I saw my parents not knowing what to do in terms of like, how could they grow when they started. They certainly had the passion and they put in the time, but there was like a limit to their capacity to scale and hence like increase impact. So I was like very drawn to Imago's mission from that point as well. What drew me to this panel today was more the discrimination piece of it. And the reason is because, like, I'm a 36-year-old Mexican gay man that grew up in an evangelical household in Mexico, which is not very common in a country that is over 90% Catholic. And it is really tough to grow up in a context where like social norms define you as not fitting, and where there is the attribution of negative or undesirable characteristics. I think the internalization of otherness and the internalization of homophobia, where you are seen like less worthy of dignity and respect, it's something that obviously it's very, I mean, it's very alive in the way I see the world and in the way I navigate the world. And I think like much of it I was not fully aware until I started like embarked in this adventure or in this process of self-acceptance. Coincidentally, this started in full during my time at HKS. I think HKS and the MPAD program were paramount in this part of the process, and not as much for like what you learned in the MPAD, but what you learned outside the MPAD, what you learned by just interacting with like a wonderful, diverse group of people, but also, you know, from some of the other tools that I got from like the more soft skills classes, like leadership and such. And I think in a way, what drives my day-to-day practice of like in development is like that empathy that comes from being othered for most of my life, like the awareness that, you know, there's always the weight of the world behind what you can see in the first interaction with someone, and like this willingness to work with what is underneath the surface. I mean, I think that was just like setting the stage of why I came to, I mean, as the same as Amna, and like, I'm sure like some other panelists, like there's like a 1,000 things that we can discuss at a technical level, and like intellectualize a little bit of the discussion today. But I just wanted to share with you a little bit of what drives me and why I think this conversation is really important, and why I think the voices of people living it through day to day, it's important for you to have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Johannan. I always find moving to hear your account of your journey and how you came out. And I also want to recognize the point of the internalization of norms, the internalization of other, and how working through that personally gives us some of the humility that we also need in engagement. Thank you. Carolyn, over to you.
Yeah, I want to just pause on say a really big thank you to Johannan and also to Amna for sharing, because I think both stories are really personal and there's a level of vulnerability and courage that's involved in that. So grounding myself in that as well. So my name is Carolyn Fallert. I am honored to be on this panel and very excited to be talking along with the other panelists. I want to ground my response in something that Zoe Marks said in the very first of these sessions, which is that discrimination is much more of a byproduct kind of symptom of deeply entrenched power dynamics, power imbalances, and oppression. And the story that I want to share is actually much more from the perspective of being in a position of power and of reenacting the role of the oppressor, and specifically the colonial oppressor. And I will acknowledge this is my first time talking publicly about this, so I'm like, can feel my heart racing. I graduated from the MPID program in 2018. I did a joint degree with HBS. Before that, I had experience working in management consulting. I consulted for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. After graduate school, I had the opportunity to move to Manila in the Philippines and help manage a business that recruited Filipino nurses and placed them in hospital systems abroad. And I was really excited about this job. It was the manifestation of Lamp-Pritchett's hypothesis that increased labor mobility is going to be the best way to address global inequality, better than any other program or policy out there for international development. When I moved to Manila in the Philippines, I knew very little, if anything at all, about the United States' colonial rule of the Philippines for nearly 47 years, and did not have a full understanding that the industry that I was stepping into had its roots in American colonial history. And being a white, wealthy, Harvard-educated American stepping into that environment, I was catapulted into places of decision-making power, power over the way that our programs were designed, in a way that's taken me a lot of time to reflect on and process in terms of how I showed up in that environment and the positions of power that I had, both being a white person in that country and then also working in that industry. After almost 2 full years of working in that industry, I left for a host of different reasons. But while I was still in Manila, I applied for the Young Professionals Program at the Asian Development Bank, which is also headquartered in Manila in the Philippines. Historically, this type of job would have been a dream job, right? Especially for an MPID, being able to work within a YPP program at a bank working on international development. So I was pretty excited going into it. As I moved through the interview process, I started to wrap my head around the fact that the United States and Japan, which are the 2 global powers that completely flattened the Philippines at the end of World War II, have the 2 majority voting powers in the Asian Development Bank. So they make a lot of the decisions about where the funding is going. In my final round interview at the Asian Development Bank, I received an invitation to go literally to the highest floor in the building and meet one-on-one with the US Executive Director to ADB, which is one of the most powerful people in the Asian Development Bank. This man was incredibly nice, personable, smart, had no background or experience in international development, had been appointed by Trump to the position because of his pivotal role in the Trump campaign. And during the end, or close to the end of our conversation, he offered to me to put in a really good word for me and help boost my resume in the application process because I was an American. And he was hoping to see stronger American influence over the way that ADB funds were being allocated, specifically within the department of ADB that I was applying to. I ended up getting the job and almost immediately felt uncomfortable about it in part because I really struggled to think about stepping into that type of role of power and decision-making, and really acting on behalf of American foreign policy versus giving that decision-making power to someone who is actually intended to benefit from ADB funds. So someone from the Asian region, ideally someone who would be benefiting directly from the types of programs that ADB is working on. COVID hit. I think, like a lot of people, I had a bit of an existential crisis. I ended up moving back to my hometown of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in the United States. And I'm currently writing a memoir about my experience living as an American in the Philippines, trying to make sense of a lot of the experiences that I had there, trying to understand how, as a white, wealthy, American, Harvard educated, straight, cisgender woman, how I show up in those environments and give power back to the people that really deserve to have it, especially in the context of international development. Writing has helped me kind of process all of this, and also I'm hoping at the end help me figure out what my next best move is in terms of engaging in international development. So that's my story. Happy to answer more questions, but I'll throw it back to Michael.
Thank you so much, Carolyn, both for giving the personal dimension of your experience and giving us this prism into how power structures manifest themselves, including within international organizations. Now we'll go to Rodrigo. Over to you.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Michael. And again, stuff to follow this panel, but again, honor and really, really happy to be here. I think that from my perspective, again, my name is Rodrigo Salvador. I'm originally from Argentina. Before going into MPID, I started my career in Goldman Sachs in New York, then went to Central America Development Bank in Honduras, and I spent time in there. Then went to the MPID, and then after that went to the African Development Bank in Tunis, right? And then I came to the Gates Foundation, and now I'm based here in DC. I think that, a couple of things from my end. Obviously, I grew up in Argentina, and it was a middle class, right? But so not really, feeling the oppression from that perspective on the income level, but yes, on the institutional side, right? You grew up in Argentina, and again, you kind of stuck in the Groundhog Day with the IMF programs, all over and all over. So no matter which decade you are waking up, you always have an International Monetary Fund program in there. And so a lot of what drove me into study economics, actually going into economics and MPD, is to actually understand that better, right? What was that power struggle, between that and how that actually affected people? You could see that was an everyday thing in Argentina. You were actually taking a bus and you were going to see graffitis, right, referring to that in the streets. And that was what really actually came to, again, a curiosity, intellectual curiosity, but also to understand from the inside what that is. And I think that actually helped me, a lot. Also coming from Argentina, I think that also helped me a lot to relate, right, to people in other, even, in other continents, and found a lot of similarities, right, between what we were doing, even working in far places like Africa, right, or Southeast Asia. Those are things that, you really connect people because they were really in the same level of relationship in many ways, right? And how the institutions can actually have an effect, and the power dynamics at the global level can have an effect on how we relate to each other. I think that the other thing, that I wanted to bring also for this audience, and in particular for like MPID, is that, differentiation between the two sets of institutions that I actually have the privilege to work on, right? One is kind of the MDBs, the multilateral development banks. The other one is kind of the Gates Foundation. And they are really very different, right? In their constituency, in the DNA, in how they were really formed. And that really shapes the dynamics that you actually experience there, right? In the NDBs, as Caroline was saying, right, it's a very much not a lot of diversity was embedded in their original constituency of those institutions, right? Even in, in the Bretton Woods side, perhaps the ones that actually are coming now are much more diverse, but that wasn't at the core of it. And I think that is an important part. But in many cases also, there were very powerful instruments, right, of external and foreign relations and foreign politics. So I think that in that, I categorize these things between proactive and reactive, right? And you can see how much reactive and proactive the institutions are, not only in terms of typology, but also across time, right? So when I was working at the NDBs, it was really much a reactive, kind of institution. We need to do things because people is telling us, right, and ticking boxes, right? I think that with time, they are moving slowly from those reactivity to a little bit more of proactivity, but it's really, really hard, right? It's really, really hard. Then you go to the Gates Foundation, which is all about proactivity, right? It's a more progressive institution. And doesn't mean that, obviously it's a constant journey, but you have like really, it's more on the proactive side and trying to lead on that. And that creates its own problems because to sometimes lead while you are in your own search, in your own, like pathway. And I think that is a key thing here, right? That, in many ways, we have to be, learning as we go and building the ship as we sail. I think that the last comment I'm going to make in terms of my experience so far, and then we can go to how to do it, is the similarities across these institutions, the similarities also across of some of the work that NPAD do and some of the positions that we are, because in both sides on the NDBs and I think on the Gates, you are actually have an impact, a cascading impact, right? I mean, these institutions actually finance projects. These institutions actually provide grants. So what you do, right, can have a catalytic impact, both on the positive side, also the negative side as well. So I think for different views of our professional careers, we are, some of us are going to be in those positions of decision-making power, right, that have that characteristic or influencing a lot of other people. And I think for me, that's again, that is what's so important to make sure that we are very clear, right, on the things that we do know and the things that we don't know about this, right? And how we're going to stay true to that is extremely relevant. So again, I think that all these ingredients, all these elements, I think, starting to hint all the things that we can do to change. But sometimes this is important, again, in my mind, to put all the things in perspective and see not only the difference, but also the similarities that we might be finding, right, in institutions and also how relate with others.
Good. Thank you so much, Rodrigo. I loved your comment that one of our challenges for all of us, it's still a challenge for me, is how to both be engaging in development, you said lead, or when we're in positions of power, but also on our personal journey. And that we need to be conscious of that and managing that always. Let's, I think I'd like to hear from each of you, but we'll also be transiting into where some of you are already into kind of what can be done. I think I'd like to hear, what advice would you give to others with this panel? And many of you have done a lot of reflection on very much how to navigate managing the personal. All of us have, as I think has been well recognized, have actually engaged in development from positions of power or privilege or some kind. And how do we both recognize that and act within that? Amna, would you like to start on that? And also, I think what I'd like, go into what to do in practice, as well as how we kind of manage ourselves in this. And I'm beginning to get questions, which I will be fielding in a moment.
So thank you to all of the panelists for sharing the wonderful and insightful stories. As far as bringing about change is concerned, I'll talk about gender, and then I'll also talk about the development sector institutions broadly. So when it comes to empowering women, for example, inside the workplaces, we already know of a few strategies. So women supporting other women is powerful. Having male allies is also incredibly helpful. Then in my previous roles, just increasing the exposure of men maybe traveling with them, going with them to different areas, showing them how it's done, showing them that traveling with women is not going to be a security risk for them. Also changing the perspectives of people at the local level. So the salespeople we interact with, just making them feel comfortable about having a conversation with women. So these are the different, these are tiny things that you do to change people's perceptions. And then if you want to bring about a larger change, it's the same set of tools, bringing evidence from the field, presenting the same evidence repeatedly, because this is not something that can be solved over the course of a single conversation. And also just highlighting the issues again and again, doing negotiations in circles. So you build groups of people who believe in your vision. All of those are strategies that are effective in bringing about change. But then there are some donor organizations, I'm talking not just about gender, but also about achieving other development objectives, such as reducing poverty, increasing incomes, etc. There are some donor organizations that are more effective at that, and there are some that struggle with that. And I think when I want to present what works well, there are two different strategies coming from two different schools of thought, but having similar methodologies. So Kennedy School developed this concept of problem-driven iterative approach. And on the other hand, in the when we interact with tech companies, they have this design thinking philosophy. I think both of them teach the same thing, and that is that you try to understand the problem first, you try to understand what the users want, and then you develop solutions accordingly. As far as PDIA is concerned, I've seen some large multilaterals publicly proclaim that they are using this concept, even though they're not implementing it really, they're really struggling with it, because they already have a preferred solution in mind. They have all these incredibly intelligent people on their team. Some of them can be local, some of them will be international. They've got PhDs from the right places, they have experience, and they think that they already know what tool will solve the problem, and thus they frame the problem in such a way that the only way to solve that problem is to use the tool that they like. It can be a technology tool, it can be some other conceptual tool. So even though when people do PDIA, they still can do it wrong. And this is more common in the larger development sector players. I think Rodrigo also very rightly pointed out that there's some entities that are more proactive, and there are others that don't understand exactly what has to be done. So often the larger multilaterals tend to struggle with understanding the problem and then also developing the solution. But with the smaller, nimbler donors, they tend to do a better job at it. I was a huge fan of the work that Australian Aid was doing earlier in Pakistan. And since they were smaller donors, so they would make a lot of effort to go into the field, ask the people what they want, and then develop solutions accordingly. With women, a lot of our assumptions were also found to be incorrect. So, for example, in one intervention, we thought that if we teach a higher variety of skills to women, they will be able to experience upward mobility, because that is what the men also do. They learn more skills, the more they diversify their skills, the more they can rise up the ranks. So we did the research on men, we implemented it on women, and then we failed. The problem is that with women, their existing workload was so high, they have caregiving responsibilities at homes. And in Pakistan, there's a lot of housework that has to be done. You have to look after children, the elderly, and whatnot. So already the workload was so high that learning new skills was a huge pain for them. And for this reason, the intervention did not work. But the key was to do small pilots, to test out those assumptions readily, so that when you fail small, and then you can alter the strategy and go to some other method of bringing about development. So that is what PDIA is so good at doing, that you're completely reliant on the evidence from the field. And this is something that we've also seen in our work with the private sector. So the concept of design thinking helped to teach us a lot. We are working with the G2P beneficiaries of SRs. And it was actually CGAP that did some wonderful research on SRs and found out that while in English, we write the numbers from left to right, when you present the same numbers to women who don't know English, they actually read it from right to left. So if you give them a receipt, if you tell them an amount, they're going to process that information in a very different way. So you have to design your intervention, you have to issue a receipt, you have to give them a message that they can actually understand. So just being reliant on the evidence that you get from the field, testing all of your hypotheses quickly with the actual beneficiaries who are going to be affected by that change, it helps a lot. And often smaller donors, newer donors are more open to these sorts of ideas, experiments, rather than the larger donors. So that has been my experience so far.
Great. Thank you. I'm going to, in a moment, ask Johannan to talk about how to manage this going to the starting from the problem. But before that, Carolyn, I saw there's one actually probably MPID type question. Did the labor movement experiment work? So do you want to say yes or no on that? But I know you're early in your reflection, but I'd also like to hear your reflection, what you would say to others, how to navigate doing what we want to do, which is to make a difference in these deeply unequal societies in a way that we are conscious of how we manage ourselves.
Yeah, it's a big question. Both are big questions. And I'll preface by saying that I'm still in the mess and muck of trying to sort these things out for myself. So answers that I give, yeah, I think that's part of the process. There's not going to be black and white, straightforward, silver bullet solutions on these things. Starting with the question on labor mobility, I think it's a really complex topic. Just some highlights from my experience having worked in that industry in particular. I think there are huge potential economic benefits for, at least in the context of people from the Philippines moving abroad. The nurses that we were serving had the potential to earn 10 to 15 times more living in other countries versus living in the Philippines. The potential to be able to remit that money back home to families had huge impact on those families in terms of economic power and growth. But there's a lot of nuance to that, right? There are moments and situations where it's nurses leaving children behind and families behind to be able to go and work abroad. There are moments when there's a really complex and nuanced process of helping a Filipino nurse transition into, we were working mostly in Germany and in the UK, totally different cultural environment, different language, work culture is very different. And there can be a lot of really difficult challenges and moments of power imbalance with that too, between the hospital systems and the nurses. And so, in that context, I really had to anchor the way that I showed up on the relationships that I built locally in the Philippines, and anchoring as much as possible on giving the nurses that we were serving voice and autonomy as much as possible, even in this context where I think when you look at a high level, there are systems of power and oppression in that industry, because a lot of the power sits with hospital systems, a lot of the power sits with governments that decide on immigration policy. And so, yeah, I don't have a perfect yes or no answer. I learned a lot.
But I would like to say, Carolyn, what's so interesting about this example is we often use the word complexity because the world's complex. But what's very important is to understand how that complexity is linked to power structures, difference, and that we need to, and that needs to be understood. And another thing which I may be going beyond what you were saying is I always think it's really important to understand how a system functions, and the kind of people that we are working, how we work, is we've both got to work within the system, even while we're trying to change it at the same time. We're not revolutionaries. We may be revolutionary in spirit, but we're often working on stuff. We're in the development, and it resonates very much with some of the issues that Amna was, and I think this is another area where we need the kind of reflection, even while we're doing. But Karen, you're going to add anything else on your personal reflection or advice, or you want to come back to that?
Yeah, so I can answer the second question in terms of how to do some of this internal work. I clearly have dug really deeply in it, and I'm still in the mess and muck. I think over the past year and a half or so that I've been reflecting on all of this, the biggest takeaway for me is that this is going to be a lifelong journey and process. That's not something that can be fixed by reading a single book or having a couple of conversations, that it's a kind of constant exploration. And how much of it actually is really deeply rooted in my own history and where I come from, and becoming aware of who I am and the types of privilege, power that I've had access to without even really realizing it. And dedicating the time to really think critically about that and inform myself on it. And I think a really important dimension of that is building community in that process as well. So people that you can talk to who are navigating similar questions. I think the MPID community is really great for that, because we're all navigating some of these questions. Being able to call people up when you're in a moment where you're not sure how to navigate something, it's really valuable to have this community. And not only like a community of people like the MPID, but when I was living in the Philippines, I invested in really meaningful relationships with people from the Philippines who were willing to have open conversations with me about history, current events, things that are problematic with it, and that's really important.
Yeah, I think, and I like It's a Lifelong. I'm way older than all of you, probably most people watching. I'm still exploring. So, and the direct connection with often people who are so different from us was very, I mentioned my detribalization experience in Lesotho. We were living next to a very poor family of Lesotho, and they became actually close friends. And of course, we're coming from a position of power, but that's having that capacity to connect and understand was tremendously and continues to be enriching. Johannan, I'd like to come to you. You went from IDB to Imago, and for full disclosure, when I'm not teaching, I work also with Johannan on Imago. Amna started talking about the how, problem-driven iterative adaptation and design thinking. But I thought started raising the question, there is how you do that in a way that goes to where people we want to work with are doing. Can you help us to think about that? How to do it?
I can try.
In the small and then to scale.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think in all development work, there is like always like an internal and external components. And I think the elements that can be measured, evaluated, easily communicated, that are technical in nature, you know, through survey work, business canvases, dashboards, you know, like and the like that's something that MPIDs we are really good at. But there is the internal piece, which I think is what you are like referring to, Michael. It's I think it's about recognizing that in order for that work to actually be sustained long term and to bring about the transformation that we need out of, you know, the space where we are there are other skills that come into play, and I think that is one of the things that I mean, as the same as everyone, I think I continue to learn. But I think there is like an element of just like organizational psychology that it's important to navigate those spaces, right? Like a good degree of understanding of conflict management, and like, you know, that is also really, really important. And just in general, how to set up like an enabling environment for that to be sustained. And I think, at least from my experience with grassroots organizations, I think there's a couple of elements that I think are key. One is just building trust. It's really important. Like if you really want to basically co-create with the beneficiary, right? Like being very aware of the power dynamic that you bring, as we were mentioning, we come highly educated, you know, with a lot of ideas, with preconceptions of the world. And in order to have, you know, an equal exchange of ideas to co-create something together, it requires to strip away a lot of that, and to meet people, like to be fully equals in the process. And I think for us that is easier said than done sometimes, because we have so much like so much energy, passion, and also, you know, technical expertise that I think that is important. The other thing I think that it's important is also, I think the piece of coaching and mentoring, it's very, very important as well. In the sense that, you know, as you co-create and as you know, like build a container where like and build trust where you can have conversations that are actually going to, you know, put all of the foundation for all of these technical solutions that we are going to co-create together to take root and to be successful. I think there is like a piece of like creating capacity along the way that it's also really, really important, you know? So like one of the things that I've noticed, and at least through the work that we do at Imago, is that whether you want it or not, you become a coach at some point in the interaction. And I think fully embracing that and becoming like actively trying to become better at it, it's key. Because then whenever you leave, you actually leave capacity long term, I think, hopefully. And I think personally as well, and this is just more like a personal note, I think we have to always keep in check both conscious and unconscious biases. Like we bring them to our work day to day, and we bring them wherever we go day to day. And I think as we were saying, I mean, it is part of like a long time journey that you are like where you are only going to learn through experience, but you really have to put in the work and like keep yourself accountable as well.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, in Imago, we try to take very, very seriously what is meant by co-creation. I think McKinsey used co-creation too, but in terms of really going to where the group we are working with, and as Johannan says, that actually is a difficult skill which we're discovering. And I like the idea that we also need people reflecting on us, be it a coach, be it, as Carolyn said, community, when we're struggling, and to see where we are doing things unconsciously that are perpetuating the implicit power structures. Rodrigo, some would see you in Gates at the core of the new development power. And there is, did you see there's a specific question around the power of unelected organizations such as Gates? How do you think about that, and how do you navigate this? But I should, just for everybody, the way we've designed this so that we have one closure at 1, and Rodrigo has a hard stop at 1. But for those who want to stay beyond that, we can keep going for 15-20 minutes. But Rodrigo, over to you.
Yeah, well, that's a journey in itself, right? I think that, you know, it is true that the Gates, and I've been with Gates for 10 years now, right? So it's a long, I mean, I have seen this changing a lot. I joined Gates at the 10-year anniversary. Now we're going for the 20th, 23rd. So it's exactly what we were saying before, right? I think that these are institutions that have a tremendous catalytic power, right? Tremendous impact right now on how the world looks like. And I think that one of the good news, I think, first of all, with one reflection on the good news, both in the very hard, you know, stuff and the very hard institutions like the NDBs and everything, I have seen change happening because of people were actually driving change. I think that the point on self-awareness, Johanna was saying, you know, yeah, you need to be aware of where you are. What is the context, right? What is the institution that you're actually joining? But that doesn't mean that you cannot change them. You have to work through it to see what is the things that you can do. And I think that the more people that join the institution, is a good thing. It shouldn't be a deterrent for you to say, no, don't work in, you know, in the World Bank, don't work in. No, that should be actually to say, no, it's just putting out there that there are going to be certain power dynamics, institutional dynamics, right, that are going to be at play. But I think that if you can make changes on those institutions, they have like a lot of catalytic impact, right? So I would say that is one thing. And again, in actually change has accelerated, obviously not yet where we want it to be, right? But has accelerated. I have seen that accelerated quite a lot in the last couple of years. And I think that's one thing. I think in terms of Gates, I do think that we need, Michael and Johanna was looking at co-creation. We need to be much more on that, right? I saw that journey in the foundation. I mean, if someone perhaps would say, 10 years ago, the foundation might be much more top down. We have all the answers, right? These are the things that we have to do. We're going to go and do it, right? I have seen that that's pretty much very different right now, where we are really making a lot of effort to do that more reactively, more like also so listening to what actually are, the demands and how we connect, because some of the work that we do is to broker and connect the global priorities, right, with the country priorities. So it's not that, I mean, it's also a smart thing to do, because you want to leverage resources, you want to leverage momentum, right, to drive change at the local level. So it's part of that brokerage to see how we actually bring them together. So I think that, to me, the way that we do this is by taking a step back, supporting, but seeing representation, seeing leadership to the ones that are going to be closer to the issues and the one that actually, has to actually be on the driver's seat of this. And I think sometimes, things are hard for all the donors. They want to put their flags and everything. But I think that one of fundamental change is knowing the place that we have in that change. And to me, to that question is, really looking that we are supporters and enablers of it. We are not there to be, in the meeting saying is A or B, but actually how we actually empower others. And I think that, to me, that's why I would love to then touch base with you, Michael and Johanna, on the co-creation, because I think it will be super relevant to learn how to do that better.
Yes, I should say on Gates, I have seen from a distance, and now we're working with support from Gates, what seemed like a journey from what was, I thought, a very engineering view of development, which was actually for me, very old-fashioned, which works, works in some areas, it makes sense, to a much more understanding of systems. And in fact, we're working with Gates on issues of women's empowerment. I'd like to emphasize a couple of themes that I've heard that, of course, in the MPID, we really, really believe in expertise and technical knowledge. I think another navigation that we are all involved in is how to navigate between going with humility to understand the situation, to understand how women are managing their lives, and to understand how that's embedded in power structures, and when to go to the co-creation process and when to bring in technical knowledge, expertise. And that's something that is another kind of navigation. The other issue, which I find quite compelling on this panel, is the issue of humility and empathy. And some of you know, until 2000, many years ago, until 2004, I was in the World Bank for many years. And even though the talk then was, oh, empowering the poor, only when I left could I really understand the implicit arrogance. And even almost you can see it in the subconscious way that people move and give their views from the World Bank. And how to get empathy and humility in an organization is a much bigger challenge. I see we've got to say goodbye to Rodrigo, because you have another hard stop. You've got a very important Gates meeting. Sure. Go and co-create, Rodrigo, with humility. I'm sure you do that.
Thank you.
But let's keep the any further reflections, Amna, to come back to you. Actually, one of the questions, as I hear, you are now actually doing stuff on the ground, and you're in a very much intermediary position between, say, the Gates and the World Banks and is that correct? How do you see the role of organizations like that, like yours?
Yeah, I'm working with the local nonprofit that's funded by the Gates Foundation. And I think it's, yes, Gates and FCDO, to be precise. And yeah, it's empowering when you can get to decide the design of the intervention and you close to the beneficiaries, and thus you can customize the solutions accordingly. And I think if there's one message that I'd like to give to the audience, and maybe for designing the curriculum at the Kennedy School or for designing any intervention, that is that going into the field is so important. And there are so many people who've not done that. Since we work with bureaucracies as well, they don't spend that much time into the field. Then there are people who actually come from those provinces, who come from those villages, but they never take their blinders off and they say, I know the customs and traditions of that area. I know what the norms are in that area. And they don't want to think and they don't want to consider any other viewpoint. So interacting with people from different backgrounds, trying to understand how do they make their day-to-day decisions, what are the motivations, what are their fears, how do they manage to, manage their affairs, how do they manage to make decisions given the constraints that they face. So that is very useful information, that inculcating that spirit of inquiry, that curiosity, just that realization that you can learn a lot when you interact with people from low-income backgrounds, from less privileged backgrounds. That helps to open up your mind, and then you start thinking about creative solutions. For example, one of my first jobs was in microfinance, and we were talking to a woman who was illiterate, very low income as well, and she said that if she can secure loan, then her turnover will become faster. So obviously she couldn't use the term turnover because that's a business concept. So she was able to explain it in simple Punjabi, but she did understand what would be beneficial for her business. So you can always learn so much from those people. So inculcating that spirit of interacting with the locals, trying to understand their problems, spending as much time in the field as possible is incredibly useful.
Yes, and this is really genuine listening in really a deeply respectful way, where we have to be conscious of where we are coming from, our own power, how we are seen. That's the kind of reflective part, but going in with, and actually the thing I would say, one thing I really like about the Kennedy School, the MPID, the core is so technical, but a lot of people do, whether it's the leadership, with all the high-fit school or the other forms of what I think are almost mistakenly called soft skills, because they're as hard to learn as the quote hard skills, and these are very fundamental, including where you sit makes such a difference. Actually, I should comment. Somebody did ask, what do we think about divisions in salaries that I'm not sure anybody, I know pragmatically these big organizations feel they have to work across local labor markets. That's something they manage. It's a tough decision that I've seen, because, and the trade-off, this is partly put to me, the trade-off is, do you pay people at the global level something like a global market price, which should be discounted because we have a lot of intrinsic motivation? And then what do you pay in the local market? Because another problem in managing that, I always think you should pay people well because they're working hard. What you do not want, which I've also seen, is the donor community basically kind of takes away a lot of the best people away from the really important work. And I just find that others may have views on that. It's not a simple thing to manage, but again, the worst thing if that leads to a disempowerment of the deep knowledge that people have locally. Carolyn, I think we're beginning to wrap up. Any final reflections that you have?
Yeah, it's a good question.
Let's take this forward.
My mind is currently on the question that you were just talking about, because I feel like I witnessed very distinctly when I was interviewing at the Asian Development Bank. There was such a stark transition from the company that I had been working in to begin with was Filipino founded, Filipino run, almost predominantly Filipino staff. I was like one of thousands of employees, the only white person in the room. And then you go over to ADB and it's this kind of like expat bubble. And the only Filipinos that I talked to were in positions of like secretarial, administrative, not in positions of power or authority in decision making. And I feel like that's just a huge missed opportunity. And
Yes.
it's hard to know exactly what the answer is, but
on that I can totally relate. I hate expat bubbles.
yes.
When I lived in, well, India is kind of easy because India just overwhelms you. But when I lived in India, I made sure I only worked in Indian organizations, and I often didn't immediately realize I was the only white person in the room. And then you could do.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because
Indian.
I think as an outsider coming in, I mean, there's a lot of questions about like how to show up as a person like that, but I think there is a lot of value in stepping outside of those expat bubbles and really making intentional decisions to engage with local organizations. Yeah, in terms of additional comments, I think this conversation can go on forever. So
how to continue? Yes, how to continue the conversation in the MPID community?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to see more sessions like this. I also know that there were 4 perspectives on this call of, how many MPID alumni are out there in the world. And I'm sure that there is a wealth of information from other experiences as well. So I would certainly like to learn more from other alumni. I also think, kind of reflecting this conversation, it would be so interesting to actually hear from people who are beneficiaries of some of the programs that we design. If we're going to talk about wanting to uplift those voices and those experiences, I think there's huge value in creating space for conversation with people that have met discrimination, power dynamics, oppression in the international development context, and what that means for them and how they navigate it. And their suggestions for us too. I think that would be a really compelling conversation.
I was just thinking, I absolutely agree. Amna mentioned earlier design thinking, which emerged very much from the tech development sector. How to transform that is something we think about in Namango, such that the private sector is very good at understanding their customer. Our challenge of understanding our our clients is a much more difficult, complex, but this is where we need to develop the techniques and skills to have that deeper engagement, a more humble engagement that all of you have been talking about. Johannan, how do you have any final reflections on how to take this conversation and practice forward?
Yeah, I think as Carolyn was saying, I think this conversation can go forever. I think it's, for me, one of the biggest things is really trying to change the essence of the interaction. Like what you were saying in terms of like humility and empathy. It's like most things that are worth in life, it is a practice, right? And there's times where that cannot be as present. Like you have to be mindful about it. You have to be purposeful about it. So I think really, and like it also takes some time to strip away some of the things, like to learn more about yourself and about the people you interact with, so that you can maintain that equality in the relationship, and for you not to recreate some of the structures that are already in place. And I think, I think my mind goes back to what Amna was saying, which is like deep listening. Navigating the role between technical advisor and facilitator of a conversation. And so I think that is an art, it's not a science, like knowing when to bring all of these skills that we have and that are very useful and that are also very needed, and when to sit back and listen to what it's like, listen to the beneficiary. I think it's an art, as any art, like practice makes perfect. And also I think the other thing is also sort of like to be kind to yourself and to people like around you. I think that is very important when talking about like practicing humility and empathy. I think also kindness to others and also to yourself in the process, because we're like all part of a learning process. It's important.
Great, thank you. Before we're about to close, I do want to honor a couple of questions that have come up. One is that some organizations do try to learn, and we've all been in these and I agree on that. But the consulting industry is probably another part that has to be transformed. Unfortunately, I see a lot of governments using lots of consultants because they give the governments what they want to see in a slick fashion. And I think that's problematic. And we need to almost, you have to work on the demand side on that as well. And that is one of the bigger systemic challenges. There was a comment to you, Carolyn, on the ADB. Yes, I heard your point, not that there was underrepresented of Filipinos, but that the US and Japanese saw this as very much their organization. Anna, any final comment? We heard you eloquently earlier.
Yeah, just on the question regarding the various development organizations and the contractors and the consultants. Yeah, I think it's unfortunate that a lot of funding does go to such entities, and often consultants are an easy way out, because once they give a recommendation, then the government and the bureaucrats, they're not responsible. Nobody's responsible. They can always say that, oh, we hired the best consultants in the market and they made this suggestion. And governments and bureaucracies in general are extremely risk averse. So that is why the consulting industry is thriving in the development sector. And I've seen programs where they hired an international consultant to design the strategy up front, and 1 or 2 years later, you realize it's not working, but then it's so hard to change that strategy. But just because this white person from the developed world has designed that for us, and you need to work very hard to change those rules. And yeah, I do feel that the local organizations are doing better, because a lot of them are very responsive to the needs of the beneficiaries. They're closer, and the mandates allow them to make changes more quickly. So that is certainly more effective. But then we'll also need to stay a part of the large organizations so that we can also help to bring about a change in their mandate. Great,
good. Thank you very much. I just want to close by saying, well, first, thank you to Anna, Johanna, Carolyn, and Rodrigo, and to say that as we've seen today, we are so fortunate to be connected with the MPID community. We've seen it vividly in how you've presented, but I feel it and see it in the whole MPID community, that there is this incredible combination of, shall we say, commitment, technical excellence, and humanity, and this capacity to reflect. And because we are privileged to have had this kind of Harvard engagement, you are in positions of influence and power. And that gives you as a community a capacity to, both at the margins and sometimes in a bigger sense, to gradually work with the system and to transform the system to something that is more understanding, more capacity to engage with these entrenched power structures, and more reflective of the divisions that we all live within. So I want to thank you. Thank you very much to all. Thank you for everybody who have joined, and let's hope that this conversation will be continued amongst you.